May 7, 1945, a temporary processing camp outside Plock, Czechoslovakia. Spring mud still carried the sharp tang of steel tracks and burnt powder. She stood there, 23 years old, wrapped in an auxiliary uniform several sizes too big, fingers quivering as American MPs motioned toward the medical tent. What unfolded over the next 17 minutes would linger in the memories of the soldiers who saw it, not because of what occurred in plain sight, but because of what they deliberately chose not to witness, because at times the deepest expressions of humanity are found in the smallest acts of preserved dignity. And on that May afternoon, as the Third Reich crumbled into smoke and recollection, a handful of young American G's demonstrated something Nazi indoctrination had insisted could never exist, that an enemy could select mercy instead of humiliation, compassion instead of conquest, respect instead of revenge. This is the account of what happened when ideological certainty collided with simple human decency, when the machinery of total war paused, briefly, to remember what it meant to truly see another person, not as a uniform, a banner or a cause, but as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who was afraid. The war in Europe was ending, but it ended slowly, messy, fragmented, unresolved. By early May 1945, the Wehrmacht was no longer retreating so much as dissolving. Units broke apart. Officers abandoned authority, and soldiers drifted west toward American and British lines rather than east toward the Soviets. Everyone understood the reason. Rumors from the east had circulated for weeks. Niemersdorf, Kingsburg, Berlin itself. What the Red Army did to German women was never spelled out in official bulletins, yet every soldier knew, every woman knew more. By 1945, more than 500,000 women served in auxiliary roles: telephone operators, radio staff, clerks, searchlight crews, even flak units. They were not soldiers in a legal sense, yet they wore field gray uniforms and functioned within military hierarchies. Their status in captivity was dangerously unclear. Geneva protections applied to combatants, but what were these women? Soldiers, civilians, something undefined. The answer depended on who captured them, where, and in what state of mind the victors found themselves. On May 7th, one day before Germany's unconditional surrender, Patton's Third Army was processing thousands of prisoners daily across Bavaria and Czechoslovakia. The logistical burden was immense. At the Plock processing point alone, MPs recorded nearly 5,000 POs every 24 hours. Teenage Hitler youth still in short pants, elderly Volkssturm clutching hunting rifles, SS officers who had burned their insignia and claimed clerical jobs, pilots without aircraft, and increasingly, women. The women were always the most complicated. Sergeant James Whitmore, 26, an MP from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had been running intake for 3 straight days. He had watched Wehrmacht majors sob openly, seen 17-year-old boys cling to one another because standing alone was unbearable, documented men whose frostbite had blackened their toes, men whose infected wounds were wrapped in newspaper, men surviving on bark and roots. But the women carried a different terror. It lived in their eyes, in how they clustered together, how they never stopped watching. They expected Americans to behave as they had been taught the enemy behaved. And after everything he'd seen in the camps, the villages, the bodies, part of him felt numb to that fear. Then you really looked at them, and they were just frightened kids wearing uniforms that didn't belong to them. The woman, later identified in declassified army files only as Marguerite S., arrived that morning with 43 women from a Wehrmacht communications unit once stationed near Karlovy Vary. They had walked for 2 days, sleeping in barns, drinking from streams, following the tide of surrendering troops westward. Better the Americans than the Russians. That was the calculation. Standard intake required medical screening: typhus, tuberculosis, wounds, lice. For men it was quick and impersonal. For women, the steps were identical, but the psychological weight was entirely different. Marguerite had worked a telephone switchboard before the war, routing military calls, hearing the conflict through static and urgency. She came from Dresden, or what remained after February 1945 turned the city into fire and ash. Her family had fled. She hadn't heard from them in 7 weeks. She joined the auxiliary service in 1943, not for ideology, but for meals and wages sent home. By 1945, belief systems meant little. Survival meant everything. When 12 women were called into the larger medical tent, her stomach tightened. There were no clear stories yet about Americans. The encounter was too new, but fear filled the gaps, fed by Eastern Front rumors and whispered warnings about victorious armies. Inside the tent were folding tables, stacked crates of supplies, and Captain Howard Chen, a Chinese-American army physician from San Francisco. 11 hours into non-stop processing, sustained by coffee and momentum. The routine was simple: remove outer layers, visual inspection, lice check, notes, delousing powder, about 4 minutes each. Professional mechanical, except the tent walls were thin canvas, glowing with silhouettes in the afternoon sun, and the open flaps faced a yard crowded with hundreds of prisoners and dozens of guards. Marguerite understood the necessity. Understanding did not quiet fear. It did not erase exposure or shame, especially for a woman raised where modesty equaled virtue and female bodies existed only under strict permission. When her turn came and she was directed behind the canvas screen to remove her tunic, she froze. She whispered, "Please, not for everyone." Captain Chen looked up. He had seen dozens that morning, most faces blurred together. But her voice stopped him. The terror beneath her discipline was unmistakable. He saw the soldiers nearby, the translucent walls, the open view. Regulations allowed him to proceed. Time was short, efficiency mattered. Instead, he made a different choice. The Americans in the tent were ordered to turn away. The flaps were closed. Privacy, however imperfect, was restored. The examination continued, quietly, respectfully. 17 minutes later, Marguerite received her POW documentation number W17384 assigned to Women's Detention Facility for Pazik, pending civilian repatriation. She was released June 23, 1945, returned to the ruins of Dresden, found her mother and sister alive, her father and brother missing. She married in 1948, raised 3 children, worked as a secretary, and lived until 1993. She spoke little of the war except to a granddaughter, whom she told about the American doctor who turned away. The incident was not unique, nor was it universal. Nazi indoctrination had been explicit. From 1943 onward, propaganda warned women that Allied captivity meant violation and death. Americans were portrayed as undisciplined, violent, inhuman. Leaflets claimed humiliation was policy. Fear was weaponized to prevent surrender. Reality fractured that narrative. Prisoners were fed, treated, given dignity. The contradiction shattered belief systems. American soldiers carried their own expectations, shaped by camp liberations, massacre reports, and years of hatred. Many expected monsters and instead met exhausted teenagers and women who had answered phones. The moral tension was unavoidable. Some chose cruelty. Many chose restraint. What happened in that tent mattered not because it proved universal virtue, but because it proved choice still existed. Even after total war. Even after witnessing horror. 4 seconds of empathy rewrote a lifetime of propaganda, and in that pause-brief fragile human the war loosened its grip, just enough to remind everyone what decency still looked like.